Greetings from Cuyahoga Falls. My name is Jehovah. Welcome to War of Rights. It is Friday, a special event. This is the Battalion drill and battles of the UEC, and I'm not alone. I brought a friend. Welcome, everyone. Evan Hayes, and I'll let Evan actually represent himself here and let you all know who he's with and why he's here. So, Evan, take it away.
Thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it. As was said, my name's Evan. I'm a representative of Canopy Heritage, which is an organization by Chartwell Compliance and MVB Bank based out of Fairmont, West Virginia. Both myself and all the other folks at Canopy Heritage are huge fans of the channel, this content, War of Rights as a game, as an educational tool. We're huge fans of the UEC and all of the great battles that you all put on. So I'm really excited to be here. In terms of why I'm here, Canopy Heritage as an organization is committed to sort of creating pathways for banks and financial firms to provide money for the preservation of historical sites in the Chesapeake Bay. A lot of that's Civil War, and also to create opportunities for community reinvestment via new technologies and financial dollars in that way. War of Rights, of course, is an excellent representation and simulation of a really critical part of American history that affects the Chesapeake Bay and the rest of the country. And the parks therein in Antietam and South Mountain and all these wonderful places, the preservation of those have actually also been wonderful investments in environmental conservation. So Canopy Heritage is interested in helping preserve these battlefields, improve the quality of the natural environment in the Chesapeake Bay, and we're really excited to be on the stream talking to you about the history and a little bit of the preservation and seeing these awesome folks duke it out.
Well, I mean, we appreciate you being here for sure. And for anybody that's new, what we're doing here, basically, War of Rights is a historical game. It's based in the American Civil War, actually specifically in the Maryland campaign of 1862, where Robert E. Lee did his first invasion of the North. And all of these people that you're seeing on the screen here, these are real folks around the world. As a matter of fact, this is the UEC. That means we have a lot of Europeans in this list, and it's late at night over there, early in the afternoon here in the U.S., and these guys are going to demonstrate drill as it was in the actual manuals that these soldiers would have had and trained with back in the day. So these guys take a lot of time and effort to really make sure everything looks as legit as possible.
Yeah, and it's looking great, on my end. I think it's I love the flags. I love the detail that Campfire put really, a ton of into the uniforms and all these things. You really get the sense that they did their research. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the manual of arms they'll be using is? I think that's an interesting historical point because people tend to think, when two battles or when two parties engage in a battle, they might have different tactics, but in the Civil War that was not the case. They both used the same manual of arms. So where did they draw the inspiration from?
Well, and to be honest with you, I'd have to talk to Captain Frank and the guys to see exactly which manual they're using, because I brought up Hardy's manual, which is what we always used and what the soldiers would have used as well. And I'm not sure. I think he said he might be using something else as well, so I don't know, but you're spot on with that. The idea is the tactics were brought down, keeping in mind that the American Civil War was really fought between two American armies, right? And so you had them both trained at the same facilities. There were a lot of political generals in the Civil War, but there were equally a number of generals that came right out of West Point, and they fought in the North and the South. Some would argue the Southern generals at the beginning of the war were far better and more educated. They had a lot more experience in Mexico in the 46 war as well. So those manuals were shared by both armies. So it's a great point that you bring up there, Evan, that these tactics that were being used were really pulled from Napoleonic tactics, but really upgraded. People call the American Civil War the first modern war for a lot of reasons. And the tactics, a lot of people will point at these tactics and say, oh, well, the firearms outmarched the tactics, meaning they weren't really prepared for the kind of firepower that the enemy had. That's not exactly true. They still felt that the large mass of men, even with rifled muskets, would still deliver the most impact if they were shoulder to shoulder. It took us a while to learn that was incorrect.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that. It's reading about all these battles, especially in this particular campaign, you read about how in personal testimony in Antietam, the quote-unquote artillery hell demonstrated just how much artillery had progressed from the Napoleonic era, where they were using mainly smoothbore weapons, and the Civil War was far more accurate, and with shell and shot, it became just devastating. And there were reports of soldiers basically hitting the deck, and for the first time, not really for the first time, but in large numbers, men firing from the prone position and moving up sort of spread out in a sort of impromptu skirmisher sense. It's demonstrated in this particular campaign. One thing I wanted to say that I really appreciate about the stream is that it seems like you demonstrate or duplicate that sort of weird characteristic of the Civil War, wherein officers who were trained basically identically served on two different armies and fought each other. And I like how in War of Rights, during the battles on Saturdays and the ones we have today, sometimes officers from one side end up on the other side. You have, the Mighty 88. Sometimes they're fighting for the Union, sometimes for the Confederates. And it's interesting to see how some officers have very distinct styles of command. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, or we can wait until the battles, but I think it's interesting that it's represented in War of Rights that your officer really determines the way that you fight, and it can be on either side.
Oh, it's a great point. As a matter of fact, our friend Rich Hogg, who has to work today like a damn stiff, he's working. But that's a great point. Rich Hogg is leading the 8th Florida. His first lieutenant is a guy named old Danny Boy Fritsch. He's the first recipient of the Green Heart of Valor. But those two guys, when they're leading individually, the company does look different. Even though they're both very aggressive, they're both very smart, they both know the map very well, they just have a unique style. And that's exactly right historically as well. I mean, how many generals can we pull up? Dan Sickles, to say the least, had a major impact on battles and the war itself based on his personality and his willingness to do something outside of the lines, so to speak. And that's represented here in the game as well.
Absolutely. And, on that note, you can also tell when a new company versus an old. There are some people who are joining up very recently, or companies that have formed new and they haven't quite hit their groove yet, and you can kind of tell that they're green. I mean, they still have their role to play, and ultimately we're happy that everyone's joining the UEC and the streams and War of Rights in general. But it's interesting to see how, Hogg has a very distinct style and also sort of understands the maps a little better. It's like watching a Beauregard versus, say, an Urban McDowell, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's funny, Rich says in the stream that leading is like working too. It's a lot of stress. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. The thing that makes this game so great, in my opinion, is the fact that these are not NPCs. These are not non-player characters. These are all real people with real lives, real PCs around the world. They've decided to get together, and it's not a whole lot different than a real army. I tell you, the main difference is, well, there's two main differences. One, you're not going to get killed or maimed. That's nice. And two is the fact that you're not getting paid. So as a soldier in the army, you get paid a little bit of money, but in War of Rights, it's all for fun. And you'd be surprised, Evan, that most of the guys in this channel that I've run into, in this community, I should say, they're all history nerds like we are. We love this stuff.
Yeah. It's good to know that. And, I'm sure that they also appreciate the fact that they don't have to go back home to a pup tent with hardtack biscuits in it.
Yeah, that's right. Or, I was saying this the other day, and it's so true that a lot of people forget. The U.S. Army, and especially the Confederate Army, they were really set up differently in the 19th century than they are in modern times. A lot of us are introduced to war with World War II, And the way that the Army is set up, you have people in companies that are from all over the country, different states. You have a guy named Tex and a guy named, and you got people from Maryland and Texas and Virginia and California and Ohio. They're all in one little company in a modern army, right? But back in the Civil War, it wasn't like that. You would basically muster up in your county and be inside of that company for the remainder of the war, unless that company was dissolved or destroyed or placed into a larger company when your men were taken back. So an artillery blast in a great position could literally wipe out just about every young man in a whole county. It's pretty gruesome.
It is. Along with that, just to touch on the history, it's interesting to think about how the Union Army was made up of a lot of regiments and divisions and even corps that were, the majority of them, first-generation immigrants, people who had come to the United States either fleeing the wars in Europe of the time, the German wars of unification, and all of these things that were going on, and they come to the United States to live in a self-governing republic, which is something that to many in Europe was unthinkable, aside from perhaps the United Kingdom, which, for the Irish that were coming to the United States, definitely didn't feel as though they were represented very well by the government in the United Kingdom at the time. And so they come to the United States, and then what's the first thing that happens? An enormous civil war, and they join up. And as you mentioned, you sort of muster based on your location. So particular corps were known as, the Dutchman's Corps, which was mainly Germans. And there were, Pennsylvania Dutch, of course, that had been there since the early 1600s. But there's a large portion of the Union Army and the Confederate armies that were made up of people of, very similar national backgrounds. It's like in Fredericksburg, you pit the Irish Brigade against a Georgia Brigade that's mainly made up of Irishmen as well. And it's interesting how they would begin to have dialogue between the two sides based along those lines. It's a very, very different way of understanding Army organization than we have today. Now it seems like the Army is more of a, I don't speak from experience, but you talk about in World War II, there's, the prototypical squad that's made up of individual, Italians from New York and Irishmen from the Southeast and, Hispanic people from the Southwest, and it's much more of a mix. But in the Civil War, it was a great admixture, but there was also a very consolidated structure that brought these groups together based along geographic lines and national lines, and it forged the character of the nation afterwards.
Well, it's a great point that you bring up here, and these guys know it well. For example, you look at a guy named Paul Frank here that's leading this drum corps. Well, Paul Frank was a real person leading the 52nd New York in battle. And so what the guys will do is they'll take living names or real names from living soldiers at the time, and they'll use those for themselves in the game, which is very interesting. So they make sure 18th North Carolina, 52nd New York, the 2nd Delaware, these are German players, and they're making sure that they're finding companies that were filled with Germans, and so it really brings it home for them. Another point on that, and you're exactly right, there were a lot of Americans at the time that had different backgrounds, European backgrounds, but one of the things you got to remember too is coming fresh off the boat as a term of your citizenship for America, you got a Yankee uniform, and that was true for most Irish and Germans. Anybody that came off the boats between 1861 and 1865 pretty much got a Union uniform as a to say, hey, you can come to America, but you're going to have to fight in the Civil War to do so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So speaking of, I was wondering, would you be able to tell us a little bit about who's joining us in this drill? Which companies are we looking at? Are they ones that were accurately represented at the battles that are going to be taking place? Tell us a little bit about the people that we're watching and who they're representing historically, because I think that's another fascinating thing about War of Rights. It's very easy to mirror these battles almost exactly as they occurred, and to have the individual units, and even, as you said, individual names of people in those units, in many ways performing the same attacks and defenses as they did, over 150 years ago.
Yeah, and what we're actually looking at here is a battalion event. And so you could imagine this as a regiment, a single regiment in the Civil War in an army. So each one of these individual companies together would make up a battalion. So that's what we have today, and what we're looking at here. Oh, and they've changed this. This looks really good now. They're always updating the game. But we've got guys from the 2nd Delaware, the 39th New York. I don't ever get to see the 39th. They're mostly Spaniards, I believe, from Spain. So I don't get to see those guys. They only play on Fridays. But 2nd Delaware is here as well. Let's see, 52nd. So you can see, because we're in drill camp, people are grabbing different people, and that's why it's looking this way. But you see 52nd New York, 51st New York. The 51st New York, famous for charging across the bridge, the twin 51s that went across Burnside's Bridge at Antietam, led by Livingston. He'll be leading the drill today as well. And you see Paul Frank there, 52nd New York. My favorite flag bearer, James Ryan, is here. So all of the UEC, 18th North Carolina, 8th Florida, everybody's represented, 56th Virginia. And what happens in the game a lot of times is these individual companies, guys will want promotion or they'll want to lead, and there's no opportunities, and so they'll break off and they'll start their own company. And that's true with the 2nd Delaware. They used to be part of the 20th New York. 20th New York were with Greene as he attacked the Dunker Church. They're one of the regiments that actually made it up on that hill. And so a lot of these guys are represented there. So 2nd Delaware broke off from them. You have the 8th Alabama, Alabama German Legion, and those guys, they originally were part of the 18th North Carolina. They formed the 8th Alabama. 8th Alabama were actually part of the group that flooded into the sunken lane, the Bloody Lane, which caused confusion, which led to the Confederate retreat out of that lane. So, yeah, these guys are paying close attention to who fought in the battle, and we can pinpoint each one of these units in the Maryland campaign. And look how they're lined up. It's beautiful.
They're looking real nice. You know, I'm glad to hear that James Ryan is here. It seems like he always gets the short end of the stick, so to speak. And whenever we see him on the streams, it's always a period of high drama. So I'm looking forward to seeing the battles.
Yeah, I'm hoping maybe we'll get an opportunity to give out another one of those medals today. That'd be nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought that would be a cool little way to just, let the players know that we appreciate them.
Absolutely.
You see all the boys lined up. The marching and the formations are really the only thing they can't do yet, because of the limitations of the game, not their discipline, is actually walk forward in this line. So what you'll see is a staggered line. So what they'll do is they'll lead out with a man, and then as he comes into your visual spectrum, you'll follow him in line. And the only way they can really stay lined up is by staggering the line. So that's about the only thing you can't pull off.
Yeah, unless you had a wider field of view, which would be difficult to do in the engine, to my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hardest thing. I think you probably could do it. It gets fish-eyed real quick. The last time we did one of these battalion drills, it was done in a Union uniform. This time we get Confederate. They switch off. So the first one we did was Confederate, then they went to Union, and now they're back to Confederate again.
They're looking real nice. And, I really do appreciate getting to see this, because my favorite things about this game has to be the accuracy and the beauty of the uniforms. I mean, you can really see, it's almost as though there's no two uniforms that are alike. And the facial hair, the hats, sashes, all these things are so individualized. And this is how it really would have been. It was very, very seldom that you saw a unit after substantial time in the field that would have identical uniforms or uniforms that were polished. The story behind the soldiers you're seeing that have those sashes, that's actually their pup tent and their blankets. They would the haversacks that they had were typically very poorly made, and they would fall apart, or they would dig into your shoulders. And so what they would do is they would just take all of their stuff out, roll it up into a bag like that with their blanket, and then just throw it around their shoulder. And that's what you see.
Yeah, and there are accounts there are accounts at Second Manassas of the Union when they broke the Confederate line for a moment. They spent most of their time rummaging through Confederate knapsacks trying to find food.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. Rich Hogg brought up something really interesting, too, is what a lot of people love about this game is they can trace their ancestry back. And especially on the North American side, just curious, there was a famous Hayes that was at this battle. Any chance that you might be related to that guy?
I've looked into it. I do not think so, unfortunately. I'd like to think so. I do believe that there's Civil War ancestry, but it's on my mother's side, so it's not Hayes. We haven't been able to pin it down specifically. I'm from Kentucky personally, though, so there's a lot of interesting history there, and I know for a fact that some minor engagements took place on plots of land that were owned by my ancestors, and it's very, very cool to go there and to think, wow, I'm here, and it's the same land, but it was 150 years ago a scene of some forgotten battle.
So, being from Kentucky, do you find it hard to make decisions? Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland.
I wait until the aggressor makes it for me.
Oh, that's a border state joke, folks.
We don't pick sides, but when we find ourselves on a side, we fight hard.
There you go. Yeah, I had mine is weird because on my family history is all screwed up anyway, and so this may not be accurate. But the story goes, my father's mother, their family name was Carden, 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 I believe, and they were from Chattanooga, Tennessee, or a little bit north of Chattanooga. Well, if you go to the Chickamauga battlefield and you go to the museum, they have an amazing assortment of guns there. And one of those guns on the butt has the name Carden written in it, and the R is backwards.
Wow.
So the thought or the idea is, most likely, when the Confederates got to Chattanooga, they went around and mustered up as many soldiers as they could. This poor guy probably got mustered into the army, got his weapon, and then either was killed at Chickamauga within 2 weeks or dropped that gun and said, to hell with this, and ran back home.
Wow. That's so interesting. And that's kind of the reason why Canopy is so interested in doing the Civil War battlefield preservation and also education. Where we work in the Chesapeake Bay, there are so many low and moderate income census areas that we're working with, and these people, these public and private schools, they're poorly funded, unfortunately, and that's just a consequence of where they're located. But they're also located, no more than 50 miles in a lot of cases from an incredible trove of historical education, historical sites, and along with that, ecological variety that would be perfect for breaking kids into a wonderful natural science education. And it's a matter of making those opportunities, and that's one area where we think War of Rights can be useful, because people can engage with history in a completely different way here. It's no longer just reading it in a book and then, going to a battlefield's always exciting, but you do have to use a little bit of your imagination unless you're at a reenactment. Whereas here, you can go to a battlefield and then you can come back to your house, or, you can go to a place where you can play, and you can go to that same battlefield. And I'll say myself, I've been to Antietam. I've seen, a lot of good historical photographs. The developers did a very good job recreating a historically accurate battlefield that looks a lot very similar to the way that the farms were laid out and the way the topography was in 1862 when this took place.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I was in Antietam not too long ago, actually on the anniversary this year. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was purposely there for, was to kind of look at the differences, because I'd been there before, but not since I'd played War of Rights. So I was very interested, and it's pretty spot on, man. There's a couple little things that they did for gameplay reasons that I get, and the hills are not as undulating as some of the terrain in real life. But, man, it's so good. I mean, you got to figure these guys creating this game, they're not living on that battlefield, so they're having to use reference material and everything else. And I think they did a damn fine job. It feels real.
Mhm. And we'll talk about this later when we see the map that's being played, but the conservation and preservation efforts that have gone on at Antietam are really quite astounding. You know, for the longest time, almost hundreds of years in some, or 100 years in some cases, the battlefields were never preserved. People would go back that had been veterans at Antietam, and they would place stones or markers or really whatever they could find to commemorate where they had been. But it was not a park. It was not an established system of trails. It was basically just someone's farmland, and you would go up to the door of their farmhouse and you'd say, "Hey, excuse me, I fought here in 1862. May I go place this rock that me and the members of my company had made where our left flank was," or something like that, just to help remember. It was as much a sort of memorial as it was a battlefield. But then, with organizations coming in like the Safe Historic Antietam Foundation, like the American Battlefield Trust and the Civil War Institute, and all these really wonderful partnerships that we're hoping to really help fund and finance and engage with, they've restored a lot of the battlefield to the way that it was. They've looked at the photos, the old daguerreotypes and the pictures that were taken, and they've found where snake rail fences would be, or stone walls, or where a big old oak tree was that was referenced in a command dispatch, and they would replant that and try and return it to the way that it was. And the benefit of that is not only, as we've mentioned, that you get a better and more immersive experience, but also once it's saved from development, and you put these resources back into basically reclaiming farmlands and meadows, that creates environment for white-tailed deer. It creates environment for monarch butterflies. It's really a win-win situation. So, I'm very excited to see what map it is, because then we'll be able to sort of triangulate and talk about how that particular plot may have been at risk of disappearing forever, but was not.
Yeah, and I'll lean on you for that. I tell you, the one that stood out to me the most was Douglas's position on the morning of September 17th. So when I was there a few years ago, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, that land had not been secured yet. Maybe it was longer than that. I can't remember how long it was. But anyway, so you'd be standing on the road facing the cornfield, but when you turned around and looked behind you where the Confederate position was, that was still private land at the time. There was a house there. It was all broken up and nasty looking. This time I went back, all that had been gone, cleared up, and they had planted some, I think, soybean or something in that field to keep it low. But now that position had been reclaimed by the battlefield, which is just amazing, to your point.
Yeah, that one was actually, I believe that easement was secured in 2017, so it is very recent. And Antietam is it's considered an enormous success in terms of battlefield preservation, in that the sort of very critical areas were saved from development early on, and that was good. But as you mentioned, there were still areas sort of within the battlefield that were owned by private land, and it takes money and it takes quick action to get these saved and to restore them to their quote unquote original look and what would have been there. And that particular position that you're mentioning, it gives an astounding panorama of the battlefield. It's where some artillery positions were. It's a great way to understand where the battle happened in the morning, and then towards the afternoon, and then going into the afternoon. And so it's wonderful that they have been able to raise the funds and secure it. And that's what we're sort of hoping to do as Canopy Heritage. We're hoping to bring resources to bear so that they can have credit to buy land that is really in need of conservation or preservation immediately. And then also to organize some good fundraisers, both with the stream and also with athletic events that we're working on, to raise that money so that once the land is bought, they can go in and they can replant, native milkweed or corn or whatever was growing there at the time. And so when you go there, it's almost the same as it was in 1862 or 1863 if you're talking about other battlefields, just the way that it was.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, We're all fans here of the Battlefield Trust on this channel, and everybody in the UEC, and we just love watching those guys go around and talk about those battlefields and show all those things. But I totally agree with you. I think when you start planting original crops there, it makes a huge difference. There's a lot of soybean on that field at Antietam, and that was not a product that was going to be grown in America at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But it does keep the grasses low, right? Keeps it so you can actually see everything. Because you got to imagine most of that stuff around Antietam was corn. It was either plowed under or head high. So the battlefield guys would have to spend most of their time plowing fields.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one of the main things that we're hoping to help establish. The trust does a very wonderful job securing these lands, and then it becomes ultimately Park Service land. So all of these battlefields are national parks, which is a great thing. But the National Park Service has a lot on its plate, and because of appropriations and because of changes in legislation, they don't necessarily have the time that they would need to maintain the historical accuracy of battlefields. They do maintain the field, and that's great. We very much appreciate that. But there are local organizations that could take over the burden of, say, maintaining crops and keeping that original look the way that it was. And that's one thing that we're interested in helping facilitate. A local organization in Sharpsburg, Maryland, that takes care of the battlefield and, to a certain extent engages in agriculture. Agricultural engineering is a huge burgeoning field in the United States and elsewhere, and we're hoping that we can bring dollars and jobs and research from technical colleges in the area and for research organizations to a place like Sharpsburg so that people there can stay in a beautiful part of the country. They don't have to leave to pursue a career, and at the same time, that career is also in the furtherance of historical preservation as a practice and as a living thing that needs to be done.
Well, when you talk about public land in America, this is different for a lot of our European audience. They don't even know what we're talking about. So in America, we have a federal department that actually protects land from economic use. I mean, if we're being completely honest with it, all of our national parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite and all of our battlefields, things like that. But there's this weird dichotomy going on. There's this weird thing where it almost seems to work the best if it has federal protection, but is controlled locally by the state or by the county, which is tough and sticky because it doesn't really run that way. Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And it's interesting you mentioned the National Park Service and protection from economic use, because that's absolutely right. And there are different organizations that manage public land differently. So the Park Service, a national park, or say, a national park or a battlefield park, that's something that's protected, and what you can actually do there is very, very limited in terms of economic use. In a place like Antietam, it's basically limited to tourism and the services that would go along with that. Of course, there's also organizations like the United States Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service therein. And in that, it's much more of a stewardship and conservation relationship, where the national forests are viewed as agricultural assets. And they're used as such, not necessarily safe from economic development like logging, but managed in a way so that they never are logged to the death or, grazed on until nothing can be there anymore. And in that sense, we're hoping that we can work with national battlefields to engage in a sort of stewardship practice that would allow for the cultivation of native crops in a historical research perspective. So, just to mention one project that Canopy Heritage is looking at, you think about heirloom agriculture that is focused not so much on the industrial production, but crops that were once grown in an area like, say, in Sharpsburg. You could talk about types of corn or apples that were native to the region or were grown specifically in that region, or something like the pawpaw, a fruit that would be that personally I really hope makes a comeback because it's delicious. But it just never caught on as an industrial crop. Well, why don't we allow local organizations steward over battlefield parks and restore them to the agricultural practices that would have been the case in 1862. And at the same time, it's an opportunity to research ways of bringing back local crops that are not necessarily as intense on the soil, and that could increase, local economic growth in that regard.
Well, think about it too. What if you could also teach the history of agriculture? I mean, you have people, you could have something set up there at the Muma farm, for example, and you could have a whole demonstration on how you plowed the field and actually get out there and do it. You could bring college students in and say, hey, we're doing this agricultural scholarship program, and you get out there with a mule and you plow those fields. And when people
Absolutely.
are there to see the battlefields, they can see people plowing fields. I think it would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, it would be there's a growing market for historical interpretation, and as much as you and I and the people in the UEC are huge military history buffs, there's a lot of people that are interested just in how life was conducted back then. Oh wow, look at that.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? The server can't keep up with it half the time. So that was one wing of the Army firing, and here's your other.
Wow.
Needless to say, you don't want to be standing out in front of that.
Nope, absolutely not.
Oh, man, and these guys are so good as well because it's so easy to see a line of men in front of you and everybody fire at the same position. You'll notice these guys when they fight in a battle, they almost pick a man right in front of them instead of firing at the middle of the line, which is a problem with most young units.
And the one thing I really like about the graphics of this game, it just shows like on the morning of September, was it 17th?
17th.
Yeah. It was a foggy morning. If you've been to that part of the country, you know that in the fall or in the early spring, the mornings are foggy. Especially sort of in the bottomlands where there's a creek or by the Potomac River, it's real foggy. It's hard to see, and until sort of the early afternoon, that fog doesn't burn off. And you combine that with the smoke of these black powder firearms going off and the cannon, and you can imagine just how difficult it would be to see, to know where you are, to know where your unit is, to know where the enemy is. And, friendly fire was a huge issue during the Civil War, and you can see why. I mean, the situational awareness after even 2 volleys is just catastrophically reduced.
Well, and, man, it's a great point. It's one of those deals where people forget that the Confederate battle flag, the infamous battle flag that none can talk about these days, that was brought into creation for exactly that point that you're talking about. At Bull Run, most of the people were firing at their own men half the time because they didn't know where they were or who their enemies were. So the battle flag was a way for the Confederate Army to make sure that they knew that that was a Confederate unit no matter what state or what county they were from. Because these flags are so intricate. It's just hard to tell one from the other. I mean, that is a Southern flag right there. You could imagine 200 yards away, that thing coming at you. The guys wearing blue uniforms, you'd think that was a Union regiment.
Absolutely.
But yeah, look at that smoke. This is a beautiful game. Campfire Games, man, they've really done a great job with this thing. Notice the height differences as well. Like, used to, the models were just, you got one model with a couple heads. Now you got different heights. See short guys in there, tall people in there. It's pretty amazing.
Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of War of Rights and sort of what we're seeing right now in terms of the firearms that are being used, in terms of the regimental composition. What encouragement does the game provide to stay in line? What are the tactics that people employ?
That's a great point. When we're talking about War of Rights, I'm not a huge fan of first-person shooters anymore. I had my fun with Halo, but I'm getting old now. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be, so I can't track motion as fast as I used to. And most of those games aren't for me because it's pretty much Rambo. You run out there by yourself, you do some damage, and you die. In War of Rights,
not very much teamwork involved at any rate.
Zero. Yeah, as a matter of fact, it actually hurts you to work as a team unless you get a really good squad going, and then you know what you're doing. You could lay a base of fire and then get a flank on them and do some great stuff. But most people don't do that. And in the pub servers in this game, you see a lot of that as well. What we're seeing here is an event. And in an event, these are all people that have taken extra time to get very organized. You can see how well they're doing here. And what the game does is it has 3 different things that it's going to do. There's morale, first of all. So if you look at this right now, everybody's battle ready. Well, you'll go from battle ready to engaged to taking losses and then to breaking. So what that means is that's the status of the morale of the whole army. And the way that you maintain morale or lose morale is by what they call losing tickets. And every time you get killed, you lose tickets, right? So if you're in line, and I don't know if this is the actual number, but I'm just going to give you an example of this. So if I'm in line shoulder to shoulder, and I can hit the T button and see down on the bottom right that I'm out of line at the very bottom there because I'm flying over the crowd. But if I was in line, I'd lose, let's say, 1 ticket of morale. If I'm crouched or on one knee or I'm spread out too far from one of my comrades or multiple comrades, I'm not considered out of line yet. I'm considered skirmish. And when you get skirmish, now you're going to lose, like, say, 2 tickets. So you're punished for being in a kneeling position or a skirmish line. And then the third is if you're totally out of line the way I am, let's say then you lose 3 to 5 tickets. So if more people are killed out of line, your team loses morale faster. And the point of contention is the point on the battlefield that everyone is trying to claim. And if you go to breaking as the defender and you lose the point of contention, you lose the game. If you haven't gone to breaking yet, then a timer starts, a counterattack timer, and that gives you the ability as the team to get back in there and defend that position without losing it. So if you're not fighting as a team the way that these guys do, you take a lot of out-of-line losses, a lot of skirmish losses, and that leads to ultimately your defeat.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's funny because I totally agree that there are very few games that really incentivize teamwork. And even in the ones where it's important, people don't necessarily do it. And thinking about a game like this, it is really important that your information, not just, for the historical accuracy, but for actually winning. And I think that that's a good thing. It teaches people just how different war was conducted back then. And, it's like we were talking about, you have to be very familiar with the people in your regiment and what's going on.
Just getting a few of these shots that I might use for future projects.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so another thing about War of Rights, which Campfire Games has really stepped up for the community, in my opinion, and Rich just brought this up in the chat, is that they're increasing the server numbers. And so now they're testing a 400-man server. The 200-man servers are out. Wow. They're stable. And really that's for these groups. Because if you're talking about a pub match, you're not going to fill up a 400-man server on a normal day. There's just not that many players that are active right now. But on an event, you certainly could. And, I'm looking forward to the day with when we can see thousands of men on this field. I think it would be a beautiful thing.
Yeah. So we'll talk about this later, but, they do update this game very frequently, and I'm interested, what would you say the most critical updates have been? I think artillery was a big one. The instruments are cool. They've got cavalry sort of on deck. Tell us a little bit about artillery and what they've added since they began work on this, because Campfire really has done a lot to make it not only more appropriate for the large sort of unit-based battles like this, but also in terms of making them more immersive.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, and the guys may have their own opinion on this, my personal opinion from this point of view, artillery has been the biggest game changer that I've seen. I love the big servers, and I love all the detail stuff, man. I love the uniforms. I love the height differences. Everything that they do to make this game better is a home run for me. But artillery has literally changed the way that these games go. A lot of people complain, it's the same maps over and over and blah, 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 and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, man, the better teams, the cream always rises to the top. And I think the introductions that the game has made, such as artillery and possibly cavalry coming out, at least officer horses would be really nice. All those things just add to the immersion, but more importantly, it keeps people coming back. And that's what it's all about. That's why I love these alpha games. Some of them end up on the shelf and never get finished, but some of them the community helps to develop, and it really shows in War of Rights.
So Captain Harris, we can press a bit on the guide there, so we get into the field.
Okay, perhaps left march.
So what was it again? How do I enunciate your name correctly, Danny?
Fritsch.
Fritsch. All right. You are my
Fritz.
now.
Danny Fritsch, the one and only.
Will follow the company ahead of you.
You can address him as Green Heart of Valor winner, Danny Fritsch.
Up and over.
I asked the
Hog,
guys.
known as the duelist.
Well, I'm trying. Man, we had this was way back in the day. We actually did duels on the channel, and they were awesome, but couldn't get enough support for people to come because they changed. That was one of the updates that kind of screwed me because we had it where officers could go in and just shoot each other. It was a good time, but there's a timer in this game which doesn't allow officers to get away from their men, so you have to have 2 soldiers always in the proximity of an officer, or they get a countdown timer and die. And that's to prevent what was happening early on. Early on, people were coming in as officers. They get 6 rounds in a pistol, and they would just go out and just, murk the other team. Now you can't do that.
First company.
So it's an improvement to the game, but it kind of screwed what we were trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I think that if ultimately it works to improve that teamwork aspect that we've been talking about. You hear these guys talking to each other and figuring out who's who and who they're going to be talking with. And, in the battles, you'll see runners going around, and it's very important to have the right people's names figured out. And that's one of the beautiful things about this. It's very, very, it's both necessary and easy to start a community and to understand, you're not playing alone. You have to know where the rest of your company is and also who's in charge and who's in charge of the neighboring companies, and that's how you coordinate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny, too, because personalities play a role. We talked about this earlier. You send a runner over, and that company commander doesn't want to hear from you, then they'll ignore you. But these guys have really done a great thing with their campaign, and I think you may have seen one of those where I think of the last one, it was Harris and Hogg were leading the Confederates, and I think it was Livington and maybe Toby or Stricker in this game were leading the Union, and they did exactly that. They had a little officer camp, and they would send runners out to each one of their companies to make sure they were in the right place. It was pretty awesome. Harris actually invited me to run one of those things, so we'll see. See if I want to get all my friends murdered one day. This is what I was talking about here. That it's impossible to march forward in a line without staggering this way because of the field of view inside the game. So this was the only non-historical movement that these guys really do. Everything else, they try to keep it as historical as possible.
Well, if this was a long march, just not a battlefield maneuver, but just to move the forces around, this would represent straggling very well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you could even argue this is what it might look like during an echelon attack whenever Longstreet was trying to roll up the Union Army at Gettysburg too. It's just so hard to get some of the game mechanics to work like real life, because if you had a field of view like you would in real life, your brain is really good about filtering shit out that you don't want to see necessarily. The computers can't do that necessarily yet. Because basically everything on the screen is there, and you can't ignore it. It has to be there. So where your brain might say, okay, ignore that, it doesn't exist, and you won't even see something in the game, that's much more difficult. It gets very fisheye very quickly. But man, look how beautiful these guys are every week. I asked them to get away from the tents so we could have some better images without the tents in the background. So thank you to the guys for doing that for me. Rich says, do it, Joe. Yeah, we'll see. Like I said, there's a reason I don't run a company. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it is. It is really tough, especially, like you mentioned.
First company,
there's a lot of intuition involved in this and other games where leadership is paramount. You have to be able to communicate, and it gets hard. It gets difficult. Early on, you realize it's not as easy to just send a runner with a particular order and get them over there. I mean, what happens? And this is a real problem that existed at the time. You know, what happens if your runner gets shot halfway on the way? You don't know if they've reached it. You don't know if they haven't, and you send another one. These are the sort of command decisions that was going on. You know, the whole Maryland campaign, to a large extent, hinged on a communication error where orders were lost. They weren't
Yeah.
lost, but a copy of them fell into the hands of the Union Army, and that's what allowed the engagements to really take place. You know, whether or not it was scuffed is, you know, an enormous historical debate, but ultimately, insofar as any war is conducted by a chain of command with a communications infrastructure, it really is an instructive thing to hop into one of these games and to realize just how difficult that is to keep your comms clear and to make sure that your messaging is communicated properly and all of these things.
Well, think about it as well when you send a runner out to find somebody and they're not there anymore. You know?
Exactly.
And it's funny, there's a story about Stonewall Jackson the morning of September 17th, and one of the people on his staff was his brother-in-law for his current wife at the time. And he basically told him, you need to get away from me. It would be a bad thing for my wife to lose her husband and her brother on the same day.
Yeah.
That's a pretty heads-up move by Stonewall in that instance. And Daniel Harvey Hill, D.H. Hill, who's, I believe, the orders that were found by McClellan's men were meant for D.H. Hill. He was actually the brother-in-law of Stonewall Jackson, I believe, from his first marriage. His first wife had died.
Mm-hmm.
So you see how they're all tied up together, you know?
Yeah.
When I called
Yeah, that's so interesting. There's so many occurrences like that where it seems like there must be some kind of fate that's sort of guiding these things. Like, I think the most interesting one to me is at Gettysburg when, what was it? It was
Indeed.
Lou Armistead and Hancock, who had been, you know, good friends for their entire life, and then they separate as the war begins, and they don't see each other until right at the very end of the Battle of Gettysburg, where the high watermark of the Confederacy occurs right where Hancock is positioned, and he gets to see his good friend one last time.
Well, they're both
Civil War's so
wounded.
full of all of those different, really almost storybook occurrences.
Well, it's pretty cool. It's crazy too, that ironic that they were both injured. Hancock had to tell his aides when they dropped him off his horse. He got shot in the leg. He said, "Stop the bleeding get a tourniquet before I bleed to death." You know, he was heads up about it because you know the same thing happened to Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh, and he wasn't aware of it. Sidney Johnston had had previous wounds, and his left leg, I think it was his left leg, would go numb in the saddle, and so he got shot behind the left knee and bled to death in his boot. And this is at the height of the battle when the Confederates are pushing the Union back to Pittsburgh Landing on the first day. So this critical loss at that time, you know, really dealt a blow to the Confederates at Shiloh, to say the least. But back to your point, when you have friends before the war, I mean, you had Armistead and Hancock hanging out in California together, longtime friends, having to face off each other. You know, and there's that great scene in the book Killer Angels, and later in the movie Gettysburg, where Armistead is sitting there debating whether he should go under a flag of truce and see Hancock.
Das wird da hinten geschrieben.
Yeah, so you wonder if those kind of things actually happen, or if that's in the mind of the author. But yeah, you know, his son actually came back, and he actually ended up writing Gods and Generals.
Yeah.
An amazing author. Yeah, an amazing author.
You know, those books are really amazing, and they do a great job sort of binding the history into a story. You know, I'd highly recommend them for everyone, especially with something like the Civil War, where there is so much of a story quality to it. You know, to the thought about the flag of truce, there's a bunch of examples of the different regulars or volunteers in the army coming up with impromptu truces, especially later on in the war, you know, in 1863, and then going forward. The men were just so tired. You know, at Fredericksburg, there's a story about how after the battle, the Union and Confederate soldiers would go on picket down by the Rappahannock River just to, you know, because they needed to do that to make sure that they weren't going to be attacked. And they'd be down there, and they were both just so tired of the fight that what they would do is send little boats across, and they would trade coffee for tobacco and things like that, and just sort of mix and match the different commodities that one side had in excess but the other side did not have. And it's strange to think that at bottom both these armies understood that they were more similar than they were different. And the Civil War, being as bloody and horrible as it is made more tragic by the fact that in a lot of cases a Confederate soldier and a Union soldier would get along just fine the day before a battle, and they would be locked at each other's throats, and then afterwards they'd make truces to go and pick up the dead, and they would help each other out.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing, it's one of those things that people don't think enough about, but because in America at least, when you talk about the Civil War, it was slavery, A+, move on to the next thing, right? And I'm not arguing that slavery wasn't a major cause of the Civil War, it was, but I think what's more important to realize for most people is that the common soldiers on both sides were working class people. They're farmers, bankers and things like that, school teachers, and you get into some of the higher ranks, you get into the higher classes of American society. And so you would run into people, and you wouldn't see necessarily a common man, the president of a college in real life, right? But the president of a college could be a brigadier general in the Civil War. However, all of his common soldiers were students, or they were farmers, or they were just normal people. Didn't matter what uniform you were wearing, they were common people.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the things that makes the immersion so good for me. Is as a common soldier, you get down to the soldier level. It'd be cool if they had more camp stuff in this game, because you can go to the camp and you can hang out. But you can't really interact with anything there. But it'd be cool to be able to pitch a tent and do some historical things that you would have to do in real life. They talk about camp life in the Civil War. It was just 90% of your war career was boredom and disease, and then there was that 9% of horror and anticipation, and the 1% of being killed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's another thing that I think people, forget, that the camp life ultimately ended up killing more people than the actual battles. And that's not to say the battles weren't terrible, but as you mentioned, 90% of your life is, trying to find a place to brew coffee, playing cards, and having bad food, and trying to stay healthy.
Well, and we're talking.
It was very difficult to stay healthy because you would be rationed in most cases salted pork and dry, dehydrated hardtack biscuits. It's interesting. You read some of the books about the Maryland campaign, and it's one of the points in the war in which both sides were at their healthiest because they were in previously uncampaigned on ground that had, fresh produce in the trees, and corn was at its height. You could go through Maryland at the time and everything was getting ready for the harvest. So the armies, as they were preparing for Antietam, even though they had been, dragged around and marched to death, also, for the first time probably since Bull Run, or the Peninsula Campaign at least, were actually healthy and had fruits and vegetables to eat and clean water, and were not stuck in a stagnant camp.
Yeah, and that would get really horrible later in the war. People don't really think about this, or a lot of people don't know about it, but the reason these prisoner of war camps became so prolific, like Andersonville is the one that everybody talks about in the South, was because they stopped prisoner exchange. Early in the war, if you were captured, you were exchanged, and you would go back into the Army or go home or whatever. But later in the war, Grant, when he took over the Army, said none of this shit, because the Confederates are just going back, getting their guns and fighting again. They're not going home. And so Grant stopped the prisoner exchange, and that led to a major camp, I forget the name of it, in Chicago for Confederate soldiers, and then the one in Georgia, Andersonville, for the Union soldiers. And of course, the Confederate government had a hard enough time just feeding its small army. It had no rations left for its prisoners, and so those guys suffered a horrible fate, much worse than even camp life. Mm-hmm. And you got to remember, we're talking about an era, they didn't know what germs were. doctors would probe your wound with a dirty, bloody finger to find the lead bullet that was stuck inside of your body. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Hey Jehovah, how you doing?
Hey, we're streaming, man. Can you come back later?
Oh, I actually had a question about what you were just talking about.
Oh, go ahead.
So, most Chicago battlefields, when you're looking at things, do they explain things out there? Because there's hardly that much stuff. They only talk about like the gangs and like other things about like the filming sets and all that.
No, I think
Are there actually any battlefields itself out there in that area or no?
Chicago, no. There were nobody fought that far north as far as that's concerned. You had skirmishes all over the place, but there were no major battles up in that area. It was completely controlled by the Union the whole war. But there was a major Confederate prisoner of war camp up there. I'm just forgetting the name of it now.
Is that outside the city? Is it still standing?
Well, the city has grown, so it was inside the city. It was outside the city at the time. It's inside the city now. I think it's right over on the west side, but it's been a while since I researched that.
If I can interject an interesting tidbit, there was not a battle, but there were two national conventions for the presidential election in Chicago in 1860 and 1864. And in 1864, the Confederate Army and government actually dispatched raiders to go up and confer with Copperhead Democrats at the convention in an attempt to try and create an uprising in one of those prison camps. And it was interesting, I'm reading this book right now. It's part of the trilogy about the Army of the Potomac by Bruce Catton. And he mentions how the one mistake of the operation was that they took the Copperheads seriously at their word that they were going to rise up against the North and secede, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, and Illinois from the Union. Because there's a lot of bluster and a lot of opposition to Lincoln's administration. And, the 1864 Republican convention almost saw him displaced as the candidate by the Republicans. But that doesn't. But I guess what I'm trying to get across is that even though there were no battlefields up there, the political history and the cultural history of the Civil War touches really everywhere in the United States. And in Chicago, there's probably plenty of stuff.
Oh yeah,
about that.
I mean, even in California and things like that, it stretched. It was obviously a major conflict. It's funny too. This is a little off topic, but I was reading somewhere, like Joe Biden, the most hated American president except for one. It's like I never even read the article because if it didn't say Abraham Lincoln, then they are wrong. Keep in mind that the most hated American president was Abraham Lincoln by 50% of the population. They literally left the country. No other American president can say that. Not yet.
Well, it sort of brings to the fore just the sort of strange nature of the climate then. You could have people who mostly agreed with each other drafted into armies, one a secessionist army that's decided to leave the country rather than see a democratically elected president take the oath of office, and the other drafted into an army that is ostensibly mustered in the preservation of the Union, but is also being, malnourished and sort of impeded in a lot of ways by the Committee for the Conduct of the War, the Congressional Committee that was staffed by diehard Republicans from places like New York that wanted to see the war prosecuted far worse than it actually was.
Well,
it's just strange how it's like you mentioned, it's odd to think about how the political circumstances that led to the Civil War were really the political circumstances that were, based on the political views that were harbored by probably only about 10% of the people in the country.
An interesting thing that I've been talking about lately is the fact that most of our European friends, they have a grasp of the American Civil War, but I don't think they have a fundamental understanding of what Americans are. And I think the Civil War paints that picture very, very clearly in a way. And I'll use this as an example. We all heard about Brexit, right? We know that England has left the European Union. Now imagine that Germany and France raise an army to invade England.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened in the American Civil War, because before the election of 1860, the understanding for most of the states, especially the southern states, was that this was a union of individual states, which pretty much meant country to these people. And so Tennessee, for example, was their country, Virginia, their country, Ohio, their country. And so when they decided to band together and break from the American Union, they didn't see it as betrayal or as rebellion. That was the propaganda used in the North. They saw it as, hey, we're leaving this party. We're no longer, I'm not defending the Southern one percenters that were slave-owning, corporate magnates of their day. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is the line is blurred, because what do you think would happen today in the world climate if Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, whoever else is in the European Union, I don't claim to know it all, but all of those people, if they decided to stand up and invade England, how would we look at that today?
Or for that matter, if, say in England, the new prime minister was elected, and Scotland, which has tried to do self-determination several times, or has tried to secede and declare independence, referendum to leave, the United Kingdom doesn't know what to do, and then Scotland attacks a military installation off the coast that has British forces in it. It's almost an unheard of situation to really consider. There's really no modern corollary to exactly what the politics was, and as you mentioned, the way that people conceived of the United States as a nation state. I mean, your taxes were collected less by someone from the IRS, but more by someone who lived like 2 towns over. Your conception of federal law was ultimately completely understood through local officials. You elected judges and sheriffs, and there's still places in the United States where that happens, but there's a much greater tie between individual states and cities and the country. Even in the North, when the Civil War broke out, a lot of Democrats, Unionists, or Democrats in New York and Republicans as well, they wanted to leave the United States and become basically a free city, because they didn't want to be drawn into a war that they didn't think was not about the right thing.
Right.
And so they just wanted to leave.
One major important point, I think, because Rich backed you up on the United Kingdom Union is like the United States. I'll disagree with that in one particular thing. The United States was created as a solution to the British monarchy. It was not created as a carbon copy. The founding fathers of this country were suspicious of government control, and they were very, very much trying the Constitution of the United States does not limit the freedom of individual people. It limits the freedom of the government. And I think that's something we might have been losing sight of in modern times, but back in these days, it was a critical point. The reason this game is called War of Rights is because that is how it was viewed by most people. The federal centralized government of the United States did not become what it is known worldwide until after this war. Mm-hmm. Previous to that, it was very much a decentralized form of government. The IRS didn't exist. There was no federal income tax before. So it's pretty interesting that the American experiment is still going on. It's over 200 years old now, and we've had a lot of bumps and bruises, but just the fact that we survived this conflict is pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Look at that.
Isn't that awesome?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I apologize for dragging you through the politics thing. We normally don't even bring it up because at the end of the day, none of us really care about that. What we're here for are the tactics. We love the armies, we love the discipline, and we love the tactics. So when it comes to that stuff, I think there's a way to enjoy that aspect of it without getting tied up and argue about politics. Right? At the end of the day,
absolutely.
Yeah, we're here to watch the battles.
Well, that's why I think that a game like this would be interesting to use as an educational tool, because sort of as you mentioned, And I don't want I wouldn't even say that what just took place was any kind of argument. It's just a discussion, and it's a discussion that's been facilitated by historical content and people participating in history, albeit in a virtual way. And that's one thing that we're interested in sort of bringing to people: the ability to engage in history, and through that open up the discussion of, how did this situation happen? How did it come to be that a country that united and separated itself because of a agreement on, we wish to govern ourselves? How did that government end up in this situation? It's it's not even. I feel like it's not even a necessarily difficult question to consider, and it's one that people do not consider nearly as frequently as they ought to.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And I think the greatest thing, to your point, about this game and what we're able to do with it historically is just that: start conversations. There's a lot of people, I'm an old fat guy, so I have a long history, long memory of things that I've learned throughout my life. There's a lot of 18, 19-year-old kids playing this game. They're barely introduced to the Civil War. So we have a great opportunity here to really show them the history, and not just the history of the politics, but the actual tactics. That's what I think the Gettysburg movie and the Gods and Generals movie did better than any other movie I've ever seen, which is battlefield tactics.
Absolutely.
And to Rich's point, he said this earlier, it's got to be a hell of a game if people are willing to spend 2 extra hours a week just to train.
Absolutely.
So I imagine we're coming close to the end of this battalion drill, and we'll be getting back into... oh, here they go. We'll go with them.
I think it's safe to say that they're taking some creative license.
Yeah.
with the war cries.
Well, the Confederates, the rebel yell was mostly animal sounds. Hunters would mock the calls that they would use to bring in game. So when you hear the rebel yell, it's a bunch of fox calls and deer and elk calls and those kind of things.
Yeah.
This is where it gets good. Watch them all fall back in. I'm just constantly amazed by how well everyone does in these events, how organized it is.
Absolutely.
Hell, it's hard to get 3 people to do the same thing, much less 200 of them.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the MO that Canopy has developed through the interest in this. So much of learning has to come naturally, and learning teamwork. I mean, it's a hell of a lot easier to learn teamwork when you think you're doing it for fun and you're doing it in a setting where, obviously there's some historical education here, but at the bottom, like you said, this wouldn't happen if people weren't having any fun. And I think that video games are a great way to inculcate that. People could learn history, and they can learn teamwork and communication skills, which, as we've talked about, are kind of lacking these days, through something like this.
Yeah, and if we can all get together and, whether you're one side or the other, or you have these major opinions, whatever they are, you can just cast that aside and enjoy the actual tactics themselves. It's a beautiful thing. And we've had, just this community alone, the guys I've known for the last couple years doing this, we'll sit around and have a couple whiskeys and just talk shit for hours, just hanging out, having a great time, because, like the two of us, we're nerds with this stuff, and we just love it.
Absolutely.
Great. It's a great way, great community, and they're really doing a good job staying together.
So I think I'm gonna hop out real quick, use the latrine. I'll be right back.
Yeah, and I think what we'll do, Evan, while you're doing that, we'll go ahead and stop this stream, and we'll come back when the battles go on. So if you're watching the stream, thank you for being here. We're gonna come back here shortly when we start the event. So Let's go ahead and just do the outro. Evan, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's a complete pleasure. The pleasure's all mine, and I'll see you soon.
All right, guys, we'll be back here in a little while. Until next time, my name's Jehovah, and I'll catch you later. Goodbye.